You're listening to Don't Waste Water.
When people say, oh, direct air capture, it's too costly, inaction is also costly.
Hello, bonjour, and welcome to the Don't Waste Water podcast.
If you have $1 to allocate between those three activities, emissions reduction gets 50 cents, resilience gets 48 cents, and carbon removal gets 2 cents.
I'm your host, Antoine Walter, and in today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome Luke Shores as my guest.
In the carbon removal targets, according to the UN IPCC, we need to get to gigatons of removal by 2050. But of course, we can't just wait till 2049 in October and then switch on gigaton scale carbon removal. We have to aggressively scale today.
Luke is co-founder and president at Capture6.
If we were to integrate in every water facility that is dealing with salt, we could decarbonize that facility, reduce emissions by 1 billion tons a year, do 1.5 billion tons additionally in carbon removal. Theoretically, this technology could do something in the order of 2 billion to 3 billion tons of carbon removal a year.
Capture6 offers a game-changing technology that removes CO2 from the atmosphere while producing additional fresh water for local communities. It's fashionable and timely to hate on Elon Musk these days. I mean, even in water endeavors, the guy has said some, let's say, bold stuff. If you recall, he's called for massive desalination at last year's World Water Forum in Bali.
But desalination, as I think most people know, has become very inexpensive, and so really the availability of fresh water is simply about energy and transport.
But politics aside, when the man puts $100 million on the table through its XPRIZE to solve climate change, people tend to pay attention, me included. If you haven't heard of it, this XPRIZE is not just a grand program with Elon's favorite letter of the alphabet in front of it. It's more like the Olympics of innovation. Teams compete to hit ambitious targets, and only the most promising solutions make it through each round. In this case, the challenge is capturing gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. Not millions of tons, gigatons. That's the kind of scale we need to make a dent in climate change, and we'll discuss that further with Luke in a minute. Now, what's fascinating to me is how this prize is reshaping an entire field. Out of 1,300 plus submissions, some frontrunners have emerged. You've got companies growing enhanced kelp forests in the deep ocean, others are developing supercharged minerals that can absorb CO2 like a sponge. But among all these cutting-edge approaches, a pattern starts to emerge. While we've been obsessing over fancy technologies to capture carbon from the air, we might have overlooked something much more basic: salt and salt water. There's a reason why the oceans naturally absorb CO2, and it has on one hand a lot to do with the salts they contain, and on the other hand a problematic side effect: it makes the oceans more acidic. But if we were to control and use those natural reactions in a different context and at scale, we probably would start touching on something huge. Said differently, what if we could use salt, that humble mineral sitting in every kitchen, to capture more carbon? Today's guest, Luke Shores, is doing exactly that. His company, Capture6, is taking the salt we desperately try to remove from water and turning it into a weapon against climate change, hence hitting two birds with one stone. It's the kind of elegant solution that makes you wonder why nobody thought of it before. But of course, as with everything that sounds too good to be true, there's more to the story. From the economics to the scalability, from the technical challenges to the regulatory hurdles, that's what we'll explore today, right after I remind you that if you like what you hear, you can help me out tremendously in getting the word out by sharing this episode with a colleague, a friend, your boss, or your team. Think of it as your perfect water dispenser story to share. By the way, thank you all for the super kind messages you're sending me on LinkedIn. That's what gets me going on that content journey week after week for 228 weeks in a row, especially when it involves setting up a temporary studio on the go like today. So thanks for the support, and I'll meet you on the other side. Hi, Luke. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you for having me.
Actually, we were on kind of a panel together a while ago. But to start with a bang, we'll be discussing carbon capture today. I had a conversation with Steve Gluck from Blue Tech at WefTech because he's starting to look into carbon capture. He's a technical guy and he has a brain. I'm a stupid guy. I have questions. So I tried to extract a bit what he was telling me. And so I'm going to try to look clever with that question. But if anything I say is stupid, blame it on Steve. It's not me. Saying that there are three main ways to capture carbon today, which are metal organic frameworks, biohybrid photocatalysis, and the one you've picked, which is direct air capture. It seems to have a lot of merits, but it seems to have a major curse, which is that it's 10 to 40% more expensive for industrial players than the status quo, which is doing nothing. And it has high capex requirements. First, is that roughly right? And if it is, how do you overcome that?
So I'd make a few notes there.
Please.
I think there are other methods of capturing CO2. For instance, nature-based approaches, biochar, enhanced weathering. There is a suite of approaches people are working on. I think it's also worth distinguishing. This term carbon capture gets applied to point source capture, which is from some sort of smokestack, and then capture carbon removal from the atmosphere. Those are conceptually quite different, right? Point source capture can only yield something that is net neutral, whereas carbon removal can actually have a net negative process. Both are important, but it's useful to kind of distinguish those because the public uses this term carbon capture, and that means a lot of things. I think it's also worth pointing out that while direct air capture does have this reputation of being costly, we should check ourselves a little bit and say costly and compared with what. So economists, when they do studies of the true costs of a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, come up with sometimes very high numbers. Sometimes it's $1,000 a ton in terms of the social cost of carbon being in the atmosphere when it gives rise to a more powerful hurricane, like what we've seen in the United States the last months. So there is a benchmark. And when people say, oh, direct air capture, it's too costly, inaction is also costly. Of course, I'm a pragmatist. And although I think that is a valid perspective, we are working to reduce the costs of our capture process to be palatable to business sensibilities and what the, public and governments and private sector is willing to pay.
Let's deconstruct that, if you will. I fully get the point. I was trying to be a bit provocative. I fully get the point that it is super expensive to not do anything. But from the bottom of your heart, have you ever met an industrial player who's saying, I read some of the reports written at the last COP and hence I'm pouring millions into it? Or would they always need some kind of incentive, be it a regulation or a financial incentive?
Microsoft and Frontier Climate, which is composed of Stripe, Shopify, Meta, Alphabet, McKinsey, other groups, they're buying carbon removal in excess of $1,000 per ton. So yes, a limited number of actors have appetite at those price points, but it does exist.
We'll go deeper into it, but if that felt too easy so far, you've decided to double down with a second challenge, which you're taking on, which you're saying we're doing carbon capture and we are also combating water scarcity. So why do you pick the two at once and not just carbon capture, which would already be a challenge in itself?
So from the very outset, we realized we had the ability to co-produce fresh water. But I wouldn't say that was front and center in our minds and strategy. I was at an event where I was talking to the New Zealand Climate Commissioner, a very thoughtful man named Rod Carr. And he was saying that as New Zealand is looking at its climate response, there's a certain amount of budget available in any government to climate change response. Governments are also dealing with other priorities, right? And so within that climate change bucket, there's emissions reduction, there's adaptation and resilience, of which water security falls under, and then there's carbon removal. If you have $1 to allocate between those three activities, emissions reduction gets 50 cents, resilience gets 48 cents, and carbon removal gets 2 cents. We needed to figure out a way to get outside of this zero-sum game where any investment in carbon removal came at the expense of emissions reduction and building climate resilience. And our strategy to do that is to connect our projects with being water positive.
Your kind of 2% analogy to say that the amount of money which goes to reduction makes me think of kind of a shift which has happened around, I don't know if it's the latest COP or the COP before, where so far it had always been about how do we mitigate climate change. And now it's switch to how do we adapt to climate change, which is maybe a pragmatic approach, but also a way to say, we give up. It's here. It's going to happen. Whereas you say that you want to go on an aggressively scalable framework to mitigate climate change. So are you the Lone Ranger, or do you believe that's still something achievable?
Well, some level of climate change is occurring, undoubtedly. The question is, how bad does it get? But in the carbon removal targets, according to the UN IPCC, we need to get to gigatons of removal by 2050. But of course, we can't just wait till 2049 in October and then switch on gigaton scale carbon removal. We have to aggressively scale today in order to conceivably be at a position where we can meet those gigaton targets. But then again, this gets into prioritization, where if we go to large scale carbon removal today, are we missing lower cost abatement opportunities on emissions reduction? And are we dealing with the kind of resilience and adaptation side? So our philosophy is to build the kind of framework for large scale carbon removal. We have to do this in a way that's synergistic with those other climate priorities and scale carbon removal alongside where the main focus is in a climate change response.
Let's rewind a bit to understand your path, because we met on a World Bank panel, and actually you've been working quite intensively with the World Bank as a consultant. You've also been creating a company 10 years ago, a software company. So far you had a good life, a good business, a really good career. And then you do that to yourself, that you want to go into that incredibly difficult field of creating a company in the intersection of the water and energy nexus with this carbon capture / water. Why do you do that in 2021? What triggers you to that Sisyphean work?
One does not always know what one is getting into when beginning something. I would have made the same choice had I known what I was getting into, but it has been a significant endeavor. The endeavor is easier because we've been able to recruit really talented people on our team who can help carry the load. This is really challenging stuff that no one has really figured out how to scale high quality carbon removal in an affordable way. It's one of these global challenges. And so, of course, it's daunting. This was a COVID era kind of enterprise. I was on a hike with someone I had been friends with for a long time, who I thought very highly of. And I suggested to him that it would be fun to collaborate on something. That's my co-founder, Ethan Cohen-Cole. Ethan came at this problem as an economist and someone with a very strong finance background, not from a perspective of what is the membrane that we need to develop in our lab, but really what are the existing set of technologies that the world knows how to deploy at scale now, to sort of begin this process now, because we know that delay on action and climate change exacerbates the problem. So we came at it from this perspective. We had a few other things that we wanted to accomplish when we founded this, including we didn't want this activity to come at the cost of water security, which many direct air capture technologies are extremely water intensive. So we had several of these things on our wish list, and from that, we backed ourselves into a technology solution that fit those criteria.
You mentioned how direct air capture is very water intensive. It's something I scratched a bit on this channel a while ago when I looked into hydrogen, because you have this colorful word of hydrogen with all these scales, and blue hydrogen is steam methane reforming with carbon capture. If I'm right, pretty often done with direct air capture. Usually people look at it saying, first, it's inefficient and a lot of carbon is leaking. And second, it's gobbling so much water that maybe defeats the point in the first place to do something right. Given your two backgrounds from you two as founders, what makes you believe that you can do something spectacularly better than the standard today?
I find it very fascinating how interlinked water and climate and carbon are. Most people will experience climate change through water, whether that's drought or a hurricane. As a forcer, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere impacts water vapor, and water vapor is really, the more significant climate forcer. There's just such fundamental interrelationships between water and carbon. And then in the energy sector uses almost half of the water in the United States. As we look to energy transition, whether it's hydrogen production or hydrogen storage, which is, utilizing these salt domes, which would be hollowed out through high pressure water, or if it's lithium extraction, anywhere you look, you see actually that you're going to need a lot of water. These two subjects dovetail together so well, even though in our society, of course, like every siloed governmental approach, there's the water sector, there's the energy sector. And, when an energy RFP comes out, it's about energy. And when a water RFP comes out, it's like, what is the million gallons a day of water you're going to produce? But actually, it's a whole system that encompasses both of these things. It's useful to sometimes pan back and see these interrelations.
From a technology perspective, as someone outside of that field, I would imagine someone comes with direct air capture, does something incredibly clever, and all of a sudden it's market competitive and it's there. The other way to look at it would be to say, yeah, it's like the iPhone. Before the iPhone was launched, all the spare parts existed, just nobody had assembled all the spare parts at the right place in the right time. Which of the two cases would it be? Is it a case of technology disruption and all of a sudden the new is better? Or is the case that you can cleverly shop around and assemble the pieces of the puzzle?
I would not have the hubris to say we're building an iPhone, but I think in our case, the key connector between these two issues of carbon removal and water production is salt. Salt is kind of a humble mineral, right? Everyone in the world knows salt. No salt on your food. Doesn't taste good. Too much salt is disgusting. It's something everyone is acquainted with. You very rarely read an article in Forbes saying salt is key to the energy transition. It's always some more exciting metal like palladium. And yet salt is really pervasive. It's very expensive to deal with. It's often in the wrong places. And it's often created both through climate change as well as human activity. This linchpin that connects these two sectors that we are both trying to create change in is the transformation of salt. The chemical transformation of salt is fundamentally how we connect water and carbon removal.
Let's go into that. On your website, you have this beautiful graphic where on the left hand, you have energy, wastewater, salt. Then you have a big round box in which you have your direct air capture technology. And then at the outlet, you have everything one would dream of. Lithium, green hydrogen, clear water, and renewable chemicals, whatever you would like to tune in. That sounds magic. Can we drill into the magic? What happens in the circle in the middle?
At the basic process, we have water that has salt in it. So that could be RO reject, that could be brackish groundwater, that could be geothermal fluid, that could be produced water. If you inject CO2 into a depleted geological reservoir, up will come brine. So there's many forms of salt, or it could be wastewater that has some salt content. In all of these, salt is an impediment to accessing what you actually want, which is the fresh water. The general approach to doing that is if you're on an ocean, you just dump the doubly concentrated brine back in the ocean. Perhaps the harm, it depends how you do it and, what the characteristics of the marine life are there. If you're inland, you create these giant salt evaporation ponds and, have a lot of land. It's very expensive and eventually the water evaporates and you truck the salt to some storage site. In our process, we take this salt, specifically we want the sodium, we separate that out and put it aside. And with the water, we use electrochemical methods to split the water molecule into hydrogen and hydroxide. So we have our acid and our base, and then we react the sodium with the hydroxide to create sodium hydroxide. That is a very strong base. It's a widely used chemical. And at that point, the sodium hydroxide we put in cooling towers, we expose to large volumes of air. carbon dioxide in the atmosphere bonds with that sodium hydroxide and creates sodium carbonate. So that is the core aspect of our process. The salt has been converted into a carbonate. At multiple steps of that process, we are able to recover fresh water. The value proposition of this project then rests not just upon carbon removal, but also freshwater production and brine transformation, which essentially eliminates the need for traditional brine management because the brine is no longer managed. It just has ceased to exist.
For me to understand and to make sure I got the steps right, you have an electrochemical process. That sounds like a pretty standard advanced oxidation process. So there you can take something off the shelf existing out there in the market.
Yes.
So here you break down your NaCl in Na and Cl. You keep the Na, you remove the Cl. Oh, you have chlorine, which you might be able to valorize as something else. You bring the Na together with the radical, so NaOH, and now you bring it to a kind of cooling tower there as well. Sounds like something you can get off the shelf in the market, right as well?
Yes.
Those would be your two main moving parts within the process. So you have kind of a process innovation, process approach to streamlining standard stuff. Or is there an additional asterisk somewhere which I missed?
You undersell yourself being a muggle. No, I'm just kidding. The other outputs that you kind of alluded to, some of that depends upon what is in the brine. If there is lithium in the brine, then our processing, which I just described, makes it easier to get at that lithium. So we have reduced the cost for mining that lithium. That is synergistic. It's not necessarily a new membrane or a new means of, direct lithium extraction. But what it is we've effectively been the precursor for that process, which then makes the actual act of getting the lithium less expensive.
It makes me think of an alumni of my podcast, which is Mangrove Lithium. The CEO and founder was here to speak about their process. They do a direct lithium extraction using electrochemical processes, which makes me believe we might be in similar waters from a technical perspective. They used to be called Mangrove Water, didn't get so much traction as Mangrove Water. They renamed the company as Mangrove Lithium and said, we're still doing the same, but we're focusing on lithium. And all of a sudden, they are an investor darling and they are backed by Breakthrough Energy Ventures. So I'm wondering if by trying to do good, you're not preventing yourself. Like you mentioned Forbes before, you come and say, the guy who solved hydrogen or the guy who solved lithium, that's a Forbes cover. The company who did a 20% better mousetrap for direct air capture of carbon, at best, that's a small story on the side of the page. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's the world we live in. So would it be nonsense for you to say that one of the byproducts you are producing could be the false nose of what you're doing? You're still pursuing the same gigaton of carbon mission, but you disguise it as we are a blue hydrogen company or we are a direct lithium extraction company.
It's a valid point, and I would say investors are not always excited about a water story. Your typical venture capital firms don't necessarily understand the sector. And the large infrastructure investors, they don't want first of a kind facilities. You're right in positioning oneself in this direct air capture water world. Maybe there's more kind of sexy co-products that one could brand oneself as. I'll take it under advisement.
Nevertheless, your approach seems to be quite, one, effective, and second, getting traction because you have several projects in the pipe. I'd like to understand how you get to one of these projects, because in water, in energy, in this intersection of, let's say, the green revolution, the difficulty is always in the first steps. Once you're proven and you're in the middle of the market, then you'll get support. But getting the early traction is a challenge. You have beautiful names for your projects. Let's start with one called Project Monarch, which I guess is the flagship.
Yes.
You sign an agreement to build a demonstration plant in 2023. What I'm interested in is what happens between 2021 and 2023. How do you get to that signing of the demo plant in 2023?
It was a relationship that led us to the Palmdale Water District. The Palmdale Water District had an expensive brine problem for their next generation facility. Their interest in us was less as a direct air capture company and more as an alternative to traditional brine management. As they were looking to lease substantial amounts of land for salt evaporation ponds, which cause air pollution and don't really deliver value to anyone. The prospect of valorizing that brine, obviating the need for leasing land for brine ponds became quite attractive. We managed to get support from the California Energy Commission, and this allowed us to kind of advance that project.
Do they come to you or do you come to them?
We responded to an RFP from them, which we won.
So they issue an RFP, which goes together with an $8 million grant. And so you're the best suited.
Yes. And then we attracted additional support for that project from a group called Elemental Impact, formerly Elemental Accelerator. This is an incubator and investor based out of Hawaii. Their focus is finding clean tech, energy transition companies. They were really interested in Project Monarch, and so they have been another key supporter. And of course, the Palmdale Water District has been our most important supporter.
If people want to rewind to a time where my sound was awful, Kim Baker from Elemental was my guest in season 1 of this podcast. I'll link it in the show notes, but I really need to preface it by saying my sound was awful. So that being said, still a good conversation because of Kim, not because of me. Coming back to your Monarch project, you mentioned how produced water oil and gas companies with their oil fields have this produced water where the ratio of produced water to oil is getting higher and higher because there's less and less oil, so they need to dig further and further. They've always treated it as a liability. You have chemical producers extracting bromine, extracting potash, extracting lithium increasingly, which have to deal with their flows. And for them, it's a burden somewhat because they need to do something with their brine. And all of these people, I would expect them to crave to work with you, instead of which the spark comes from a water district launching a request for price. Hence, you're building towards your first flagship. What's your rational explanation as to why it's not a BP or an Exxon or whoever who's dying to turn a liability into an asset because they could become a major carbon storage company?
I can't necessarily speak for those companies. In the case of the Palmdale Water District, it's a brackish water source. Our technology, if it is a low salinity source, does comparatively little carbon capture and a lot of freshwater recovery. Versus if it is kind of a reverse osmosis reject or a high saline source, does a lot of carbon capture and comparatively little water recovery. Our projects can kind of pencil out regardless. Either they pencil out more on water revenues or carbon revenues. But that project was motivated by the high water recovery rates, less so on the carbon capture. But I mean, you're right. The salt problem is ubiquitous. It's also present in a lot of places that didn't have it before due to seawater intrusion. So you get a storm surge and all that seawater contaminates the freshwater supplies. And that's happening all over the world. The water districts all over the world are grappling with too much salt and they're not equipped to deal with it.
That's where I wanted to head, because when I had David Sedlak on that microphone, we discussed his project with Nawi to look into new ways to do brackish water desalination for drinking water purposes. If we say that the carbon aspect of it, the carbon merit is a side gig and a welcome side effect, and the core of it is solving those brackish water issues, how would your approach compare to the nanofiltration, reverse osmosis, or whatever technology you would be using in brackish water desalination otherwise?
Well, so we use many of those same technologies. Our process can be implemented alongside that effort. What we are fundamentally doing is that last step of dealing with those salts by chemically transforming them.
So it's a stupid car analogy. It's the AMG of Mercedes, like you're beefing it up and adding that additional layer on top of it. As you've already done anyways, 95% of the path, it would be stupid not to get the last 5% and not to capture the carbon.
When the water sector thinks about a water project, if I'm responding to an RFP, it's probably, what is the price of producing a unit of water? That is the fundamental criteria. But every sector needs to also think about, what does its emissions profile look like? how is it contributing or how is it helping to solve climate change as a societal problem? So my belief, based upon statistics I read, not too long ago, is about over 50% of water production is through fossil fuel sources. And so there's an emissions problem there, right? And at the same time, we know that water issues are exacerbated by climate change. So it would be great if the water sector itself was part of the solution and not part of the problem. Of course, the water sector is not unique. The health sector, for instance, considers climate change as the number one public health crisis. And yet, there's lots of things in the health system that create emissions. To solve climate change, these different sectors in the economy actually have to decarbonize. And we can help the water sector do that while helping it produce cheaper water.
You're opening a Pandora box, so I need to play the devil's advocate here, and then we can close the sidetrack because I'm going to take you on a sidetrack here. I think discussing with lots of people within the so-called water sector that the carbon topic is something we very happily put aside, because if really we were looking into the carbon emissions of the water sector, we would not like what we would find. Not necessarily on the treatment side, but we are pumping a lot of water around on the water networks, on the wastewater networks, and that's probably 75% of the energy we are spending. So roughly speaking, that alone would be 4 to 5 times the emissions of the aviation sector. So that's one thing. And then if you keep drilling into it, the wastewater part of the story, which is, if I understand it right, one of the inlets you are using in your process, is emitting a lot of methane and NOx. And those have also, especially on the short-term climate impact, have a super high greenhouse gas effect. And so as long as we don't speak about those, they don't exist. If you take a plane, you have bad feelings like, oh, I'm destroying the environment. If you open your tap and get some water, you're getting water and it has nothing to do with carbon. So as long as those are happily disconnected, I think everybody's happy. Now you're opening the Pandora box and you say, we should look at our impact. As much as I am with you, I see how that could backfire. So would you be concerned?
You're right. No sector wants to face this issue. I think what makes it easier for us to sell this idea to different municipalities or counterparties is the fact that dealing with brine is a cost and recovering water is a cost. If we can provide a cost-effective means of doing this that is actually climate friendly, that is adopted because it is cheaper than the alternative, climate unfriendly approach. I think businesses need cost-effective means to navigate these problems. Otherwise, they don't want to face the issues. Now, the water sector in the United States right now, through the Inflation Reduction Act, there's something called 45Q, which is a $180 tax credit for capturing CO2. So if this tax credit can also support what are effectively water projects, that can be a very powerful way for the water sector to get government support for producing fresh water and decarbonizing. Sometimes this could be quite attractive to water actors through being able to tie into tax credit that they might normally not have access to.
How about scale? Because when you're pumping water around, one of the reasons is scale. We had in the 19th century to build centralized plants, and hence now we have the networks. To which people will tell you the solution is for the next generation of plants, let's go decentralized. So if now we want on top of that to leverage those plants to do a collocation and do carbon capture, do you have an idea at that stage of where the threshold might be as to where it doesn't make sense because it becomes too small and then you don't have any scale effects and it becomes prohibitively expensive because it's probably an exponential curve?
Our technology is modular, so we can deal with relatively small scales. Most of the water facilities we have spoken with are big operations, but it doesn't mean that, we couldn't support decarbonization in a future where there's more decentralized water production. That future could make sense, but you also are certainly going to be left with a lot of these legacy facilities that are very large and are dealing with increasing salt problems. And of course, on the energy transition side, you're also dealing with extremely large projects that one way or another are dealing with a lot of brine.
You've provided incredible answer to my lazy and sneaky sidetrack, so let me bring you back on track. we covered the first stages of Monarch, but 2023, if I'm right, is like a pivotal point where now you're building the demo, which I guess should be underway or closely done. And then you have two more steps, which are the commercial facility and the large scale facility. So what's the time horizon we're looking at here? And what are the milestones?
So just first quickly noting that California law requires new water projects be piloted. It's really a regulatory reason that first scale exists. Our technologies are all deployed at significant scale throughout the world. This is more of a calibration unit than a true pilot. That facility will be operational in 2025. We are pursuing a project in Australia that received funding from the federal government of Australia. That project is kind of an industrial integration that combines green ammonia production, point source carbon capture, direct air capture, fresh water production. So it's one of these industrial clusters where your treasure is my trash and vice versa. In Korea, a project that we are pursuing with BKT and K-Water is similar to that. It's in an industrial hub, and there's a lot of synergies among the different actors in that hub. Those are our three main global projects that all are producing water.
Korea is Octopus, Australia is Wallaby. Really love the names. I'm curious about Wallaby because you mentioned it has a link to green ammonia. According to what I read online, take it for what it is. I am a muggle, and I stand on that. But if there's a place you go today, it's green ammonia because today the economics align at scale there. So first, is it true? And if it's true, why don't you just chase the green ammonia project everywhere? And once you've done all of them, then you go to industrial. And once you've done all of them, then you go to water treatment. I'm sorry, I keep bugging you with that one, but I'm just curious about how you pick your verticals.
Yeah, so that project is being done with a group called Pilot Energy. To answer your question, part of the answer is who are our project partners? Are we excited to work together? In the case of California, that is a municipal facility looking at an expanded wastewater project. In the case of Australia, it is an energy company that is, transitioned towards renewables and clean fuels. We are a puzzle piece in both of those projects. And the same with Korea. We are not producing green ammonia. A lot of how we select our projects is looking how we fit in as a puzzle piece, and do the economics of our participation make the project as a whole look better? If they do, then we can generate interest, we can attract capital. These projects at the moment are bespoke, and perhaps they'll be bespoke for some time. We can fit in different ways in different projects, in part because there are idiosyncrasies among the projects like brine composition. What's in the brine? That's going to determine, well, what does the pre-treatment look like? What are the outputs that are needed? Is there demand for fresh water? If we're in a location where there's zero demand for fresh water, then that is not necessarily a good signal that our process is going to be desired. So a lot of this is sussing out the project partners, and then we find a motivated coalition of the willing, and we try and develop projects.
You mentioned green ammonia is not part of your scope. Can we just try to go over your scope? Where do you start? Where do you stop? What is exactly your offering?
Yeah, so there's a lot of e-fuel providers. There's sustainable aviation fuel, LNG, hydrogen for various things, green ammonia. All those fuels need CO2 as a feedstock, and most of them need fresh water. That is what we're offering to those parties. We are not a SAF producer. We are not a green ammonia producer, but we are a source of CO2. And typically these e-fuels have looked towards bio sources of CO2. But as it turns out, that can be complicated. Crops have seasons. If you use too much cropland for fuels, then that affects food prices. And so there's various reasons why those producers have been looking at DAC to be a source of CO2. If you have the renewables present, you can make that CO2 all year round. You don't have to worry about corn prices in May or whatever.
For me to understand your business model, that means that what you're selling them is actually CO2 compound. probably aggregate with something else. Let's say carbon compounds. That's what you're selling. Or do you also have like CapEx sale of equipment or an ongoing fee of a process? How do you deal with that?
So our projects are individually capitalized and they're their own entities. Capture6 is both a technology developer because we had to be because this process didn't exist. But we're primarily project developers. These are expensive projects. It doesn't make sense for us to raise equity in order to fund these projects. We have to create viable project structures that attract capital and financing. We do this sometimes in partnership.
So it's debt-based project financing because your initial 6 million of seeds and the grants you had to develop the first project enabled you to build the tech stack. Now there are still huge investment costs, but the type which you would have in any kind of large-scale CapEx project.
Yes.
And there it fits pretty well with your World Bank background.
And we have people on the team that are also strong in that regard, including my partner.
Your team is 25 people, right?
18.
Okay. So you have 18 people. Out of these 18 people, is it like 16 sales guys and the 2 co-founders? Or is it like, just trying to get a rough understanding of what's involved in a company like the one you're building?
So it's roughly split between engineering and project development. And of course, there are some operations people to make sure the lights are on and people are paid and whatnot.
I see. You have these 3 main projects which are in development stage, plus one, I guess, which is closer to home for you in New Zealand. They will start rolling out in 2025, 2026, 2027. So how do you survive on that path? What do you actually look for right now? Is it more funding? Is it more pipeline? Is it more partnerships? Where do you want to develop? In which direction do you need to develop first?
So a lot of what we have to do at the moment is execution on our existing projects. I've had a million conversations where people get a little risk averse, right? Because they fundamentally want to kick the tires of the thing. Ironically, when you talk to engineering companies, they look at our technology stack and say, oh yeah, that'll work. And that's kind of the end of the conversation. But when you talk to investors, most of them don't come from this background at all. And so to them, this is all just a black box. And so the most important thing for us to be able to go out and go to large scale is to have a couple of these facilities in operation, generating data, and then that would make subsequent investor conversations much easier.
If I try to put that in my words, that means that the proof of concept doesn't need to be established for technical people because as you're leveraging Lego bricks which exist, engineers look at it and say, yeah, that flow sheet will work. But investors will need to be able to grasp it, touch it, and see, oh, you've reduced so much carbon and you're delivering so much C compounds to that industry. I've seen it working for 6 months. Now I'm ready to getting to the next scale.
Absolutely. And the investors also need to see what the business returns look like. These are the markets. This is how it grows. But it is funny because when we talk to the big engineering firms, we spend about 10 minutes on the technical due diligence and they just get it. They have these backgrounds. And as you say, these are Lego bricks that are well characterized, high technology readiness level. So it's really at the investor level. Of course, there are some investors that get it, but they are few and far between. There are many VCs that want to be part of the clean tech transition, but most of them are coming out of being, investors in companies. And so it's just fundamentally a very different thing to understand.
You're touching onto something with this return on investment and how the top line of the company will look like. On the water end of the story, we look at our carbon friends and we're like, oh, those guys, they're so blessed because all the conferences are about carbon. And so zero carbon is a message everybody gets. And there's this holy grail of the carbon credits. People have been talking of a global water credit, global water index, whatever it might be. And the reference is carbon credit. I always was under the impression that is something you can sell today. It is absolutely normalized. And then that's the way to finance project. On your website, I found out that I can buy carbon credits and hence participate in the development of your project. But also there's this weird animal to me, which is the Capture6 CDR credit. And I'm like, so it's not the standard stuff. You need to develop something per se for what you're doing. What am I missing here?
I don't like this term carbon credit. If you think about it, it's kind of like someone says to you, I have a car I'd like to sell you. Your first question is, what kind of car? Does it work? Or does it have tires on it? Is it a sports car? Is it a tank? The term car covers a lot of possibilities. And it's not very revealing about what the underlying thing you're being sold is. You can get carbon credits from all sorts of things. People have built solar farms and said, we get X number of carbon credits because we could have built a coal plant, and a coal plant would have emitted a lot of CO2. Now, at one point that might have made sense, but as solar technologies get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, no one's building a new coal plant anymore. So awarding that project carbon credits is really, there's zero cost to those carbon credits because they're going to build the solar farm anyways. The same thing with some nature-based credits, like whether or not there's a carbon credit or attached to it. If an acorn falls off an oak tree, it might grow a new oak tree. That oak tree sequesters carbon. So did that carbon credit meaningfully advance that forest and protect it? Or did someone just find a forest and say, this is worth a certain number of carbon credits? My point being is there can be carbon credits of very dubious value, right? So the term CDR is used, and we didn't come up with the term CDR, but it's used to designate actual physical carbon removal from the atmosphere, not just the avoidance of emissions. Leading buyers like Microsoft and Frontier Climate have these standards for for CDR purchases, that it has to be highly durable or preferably permanent. It has to be irreversible. You don't want a credit that 5 years later, after capturing the CO2, it just goes back into the atmosphere. There are these kind of characteristics that denote basically high quality credits. And that is what we're trying to produce.
So again, to take a weird analogy, if I'm walking to my daughter's school to pick her up, I'm anyways walking to the school. But if I kick off my sports app, it's going to tell me I burned so and so many calories to go there. And then I can come back home, eat an ice cream, which has exactly the same amount of calories, and say, hey, I own it because I exercised. Or I can put my running shoes and go out for a run, and this time really exercise for real because I want to go on a diet, and then come back and say I've saved so and so much. And that's the difference between the embedded carbon credit, which is there anyways, and the one where you're doing a purposeful effort to grab the goal.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not against nature-based approaches. There's many good ones out there, but climate change itself has made forests vulnerable to forest fires, right? So if we pin all of our hopes in forests solving this problem, and they themselves have become more vulnerable to reversals from forest fires, then that could potentially be a problem.
So if you follow your aggressively scalable framework and you have this gigaton objective in mind, because that's what the IPCC is pushing the words toward by 2050, what is Capture6 section of that impact?
So our back of the envelope math of this is that if we were to integrate in every water facility that is dealing with salt, we could decarbonize that facility, reduce emissions by 1 billion tons a year, do 1.5 billion tons additionally in carbon removal. Theoretically, this technology could do something in the order of 2 billion to 3 billion tons of carbon removal a year.
So what you're advocating for is to say that we used to have that conversation around wastewater treatment plants becoming water resource factories, and you're saying, let's rebrand them all together in carbon sinks.
They could. And if the ultimate goal of the IPCC is to get to something like 6 or 7 gigatons of CDR removal a year, getting 2 billion tons from the water sector would obviously be a significant portion of that objective.
You mentioned California and the regulations in California, which can be sometimes a plus, sometimes a bit in the way. I'm not from California. I can judge it from far. I'm just connecting a dot to the Energia stories in California with the Rialto bioprocessor and stuff like that. And 10 years before that, the slurry carb, can't exactly remember the name, but it was in Rialto as well. All of those had this carbon merit in the core of what they were trying to do. And all of them ended up hitting a wall because the regulation was postponed. The market conditions changed. Do you believe that as an entire society, we have learned our lessons, and that at least if regulations are not going to push it, at least they won't prevent stuff from happening? Or could we still face strong headwinds, which makes the entire approach utopic of doing those billions on your end and reaching the gigaton worldwide?
Regulations are going to push both ways. Regulations are also tightening on brine dumping. It was just the norm that you can build your desalination facility and dump the brine back into the ocean. It turns out a lot of local communities don't like their fish dying. Regulation, of course, we have to deal with when developing projects, but it's also regulation that is motivating projects. California does significantly impact the global economy when California has the low carbon fuel standard, or when California says, it's not going to allow the sale of internal combustion engines after 2030. Those things have an impact far beyond California. So in the direct air capture space, California has something right now called CALDAC that is a U.S. Department of Energy funded program. We are a participant in CALDAC. And that is looking to figure out how to deliver value of these projects to communities. Because ultimately, if this technology approach is going to scale for ourselves and others, there has to be something that's delivered of value to communities. And maybe that's jobs, but ideally it's more than jobs. And, communities actually want these efforts.
On a mission vision perspective, what is your 2030 top line? Is it those jobs, welcome side effects, sustainability, ESG indicators, or is it the billions of tons we discussed before?
We are definitely not getting to a 1 billion ton project by 2030, nor is anyone in the world. I think the important thing is, does the pathway become clear? What does that mean? That means that you figure out the implementation. This becomes more plug and play, right? It's more understood on an engineering perspective. You know how to find the right projects. The investors become comfortable with this. This is going to, yield X ROI, and that's kind of within the investment window. By 2030, having more of that clarity on what is that path towards very large scale projects. While we have been intentional about using relatively off the shelf technology for our projects, that's not to say that these technologies can't be further optimized for this use case. For instance, cooling towers are optimized for heat transfer, yet our reaction needs to be optimized for mass transfer. We receive funds from the U.S. Department of Energy to actually, kind of look at cooling towers and figure out what could we do that could yield further efficiency gains. Part of our approach to driving down costs is creating co-benefits that we can valorize. And part of it is enhancing the efficiency of the unit technologies and integrations.
And what needs to happen in the next 6 months or 12 months to keep you on that track? What are your immediate KPIs?
Just stay focused on these 3 projects. We have a relatively small team and need to stay focused on these projects. I believe in empowering, a team, and I'm sort of the, Steve Jobs philosophy that you don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. We have a fantastic team, and keeping them energized about executing on our pipeline is our 6-month task.
How do you handle 3 continents with 18 people?
In part through project partners. We also have staff in South Korea and in New Zealand. Coordinating over time zones is not always easy, but we have had a philosophy that in this particular space of direct air capture, everyone is coming to the United States and Canada because of the tax credits. But this problem of climate change is not solved simply through projects in those countries. There is a need to develop projects in multiple places, and the package of incentives may be a little different in Australia than in the United States, but you can still make profitable projects.
When will you start operating one of the 3 projects? Which one will come first?
Monarch will come first.
And when?
It should be operational in 2025.
You said 2025, but we're end of 2024. So 2025 can be in 2 months. And can be
probably towards the end of 2025.
I was trying to go when would it make sense to make a follow-up. So that's all it is. There's no trick here.
I'm sure you know Hofstadter's law, which is things always take longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law.
That's a good one. I would be super happy to make a follow-up when you're live. You will have a proof of concept to show your investors. I'm pretty sure the people listening would be super happy to have your numbers as well. Everybody will root for you, including your competitors. It's also a difficult place to be because you're opening a path. Thanks a lot for everything you shared in the deep dive. To round it off, I have some rapid fire questions. If that's fine for you, I'll switch to that last section.
Go for it.
It's time for the rapid fire questions.
What is the toughest challenge, in your opinion, for a water tech startup?
Finding the right investors. As I alluded to, the infrastructure investors want completely de-risk projects. The VCs aren't used to the sector, so it's hard to find the right investor.
What would be your best single piece of advice for the founders and managers of the about 1,000 early stage water startups?
There's a lot of startups that have a solution in search of a problem. And there are cases throughout history where that's been successful. Henry Ford famously said if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. But I think in general, it's good if there's an actual pain point that your approach can solve.
What's the drop of knowledge you wish more investors knew about the water sector?
The growth potential is going to be huge, in part because of climate change itself. And as you on another podcast that I heard have said, it's a very fragmented sector, but there's scope for a lot of innovation and growth in it.
What was your most unexpected partnership and what did it bring you?
Elemental Impact was an unexpected partnership. They're a nonprofit investor, so a very unusual, entity. They have some really significant supporters, including Laureen Powell Jobs. They're willing to take some risks on companies that maybe traditional VCs would pass on. They have a social mission, which I think is very strong and really important. And they also do something which is really fun, which is once a year, they bring everyone of their founders together to a lovely spot on the North Shore of Oahu. This can be tough being in the trenches, obviously, as a founder of the company. And it's good to commiserate with other people, particularly in a really beautiful spot.
I was going to say that. It's hard to commiserate so much in Hawaii. By the way, curiosity question. Usually they back projects which would be then whether in California or in Hawaii. Was it at some point something which is on the map to have something in Hawaii?
No.
Okay. Profitability or growth?
I think profitability. And I say that because we have no end of interest for what we're doing, in part because this brine challenge is global. There was a recent science study that said there's something called freshwater salinization syndrome, and humanity has crossed the threshold for the safe boundary condition for it. I don't see an end to the appetite for these projects, but showing investors these can be profitable and can be done effectively is really the key. And at that point, the number of project opportunities is nearly limitless.
Makes absolutely sense because I guess it's really the type. When you're in water tech, you may want to establish your market share and then try to be profitable, even though that path in the water sector itself is much more difficult than it would be for Uber or for whoever goes the hypergrowth path. But in your case, anyone on the street will agree that there is a way up which is tremendous. If you can show that it's profitable on top of that, then the rest is a no-brainer.
Maybe a no-brainer.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good one. What's the next profile you'll hire?
A really seasoned process engineer that knows how to integrate things. And when challenges in project development arise or project construction that inevitably do, it has, experienced that 5 times in, several past companies and knows the path forward.
Your hand's answering my next question, so I'm going to tweak it a bit because the question is sector experience or startup experience, which I'm going to tweak into water sector experience or energy sector experience?
Probably water sector experience, but I would say there is a certain personality type that wants to be involved in a early stage company with a growth trajectory, relative to a large established company. There's less structure, right? And roles, there's more moving pieces on a week to week basis. So you have to find people that relish that, which is not to say someone has to have startup experience, but they have to want to have startup experience. Ideally, they bring sector experience along as well.
You're looking for the 7-legged sheep. So usually it's 5, it's 7, but it's interesting. If you're that 7-legged sheep, I guess you can reach out to Luke. It would be Happy to hear from you. What's that tool nobody speaks about, but you couldn't live without?
Periodic in-person meetings. We conduct a lot of our kind of lives on Zoom calls. And for the most part, it's quite effective, I find. But every now and then, if you really want to have a substantive conversation, brainstorm, or get to know someone beyond the technical scope of what you're discussing, like I find those in-person get-togethers invaluable. My whole team is meeting next week in California, and I'm really looking forward to it because in terms of bringing the team together, energizing, the group, kind of solving the nagging problems that no one can quite get their head around. I think a lot of breakthroughs happen in those kind of settings.
What are you desperately needing and want to raise an open call for right now?
I'm fortunate to say that having completed our first part of our Series A, we are not in a desperate situation. I guess the idealist in me wishes there was more investors lean into these areas. There's a million groups that have stated climate goals, but I wish there were more impact investors. I read newspaper articles on McKinsey, Bezos, but connecting to these people is very difficult. And I think most investors in this space are still fundamentally constrained. There's still social mission is, slide number 27 in the slide deck. And I'm a pragmatist, so we want to make projects profitable for investors, but it would be great if there were more mission-driven investors.
It's a totally different field, but that makes me think of the conversation I had with Gary White earlier this year, where he was explaining how they are opening a category, which is money which is for profit. So it's not charity money, and it's not the type of profits you would have if you invest in Philip Morris or whatever right now, because you're going to make nice return on investment, but it's not so well from an impact perspective. Creating that in-between category is tricky because you will have people which are wealthy enough and want to give back and are happy to do philanthropy. And you will have people who really want to make high double-digit return on investment every year. And that in-between sphere, even though the most sustainable of all of them, is difficult to carve. So I guess that's the road you're on.
Absolutely. The other thing that's missing is there are foundations that want to invest in good things, but those groups often lack the technical skills to do due diligence of a company like ours. So, there's a number of gaps in the system. There's financing for first-of-a-kind facilities. The Department of Energy has a program for this, but $100 million is the minimum threshold. So there are lots of people are seeing these gaps and trying to kind of figure out how to fix it. Ideally, it should not be so hard for water companies, climate companies to launch first-of-a-kind facilities. There should be more support because these are sorely needed if we are then going to pivot to very large facilities that can make significant impacts on climate change mitigation.
I won't be able to fix the system. I have my circle of influence is very limited, but still, what can and should I do for you?
I appreciate this conversation. Sometimes it's strange how things transpire. For all I know, someone will listen to this and I'll have a conversation. I can't always see the outcomes of different things. But in this space, there's a lot of even getting people up to speed that there are alternatives to standard processes. So for instance, we have the ability to mineralize CO2. There's countless media articles on CO2 pipelines. Should we build one? Should we not? Where should it be? Communities don't like it. Most people aren't even aware that you can mineralize CO2, which completely eliminates the need for a CO2 pipeline. So that's just one example, but another example would be brine. Like you can chemically transform brine into something else. That's probably something in the water sector that 3% of people have even heard of. So when they're contemplating their next project, that's not even on their radar as one of the potential approaches. Socializing new ideas, new approaches for doing things is a very important function.
I have that project somewhere in my bucket list somewhere to list everything you could get out as welcome side effects or byproducts of a typical water or wastewater treatment plant, which you have to build anyway. So I guess I have to bring it back on the top of the pile. Anyways, I have a bonus question. We are rapidly approaching the demo day of the Aquapreneur competition you were judging for the World Bank last year. Have you been mentoring one of the teams? Can you share a bit about that and tease people to why they should be attending Demo Day?
I have been mentoring one of the teams. It's not easy to do it from the United States for a project in Africa, although I wish it was different. Some of my network and investors, it's hard to bridge that gap with small scale projects in the developing world. My hat is off to these aquapreneurs because when I participated as a judge, I was really impressed with their creativity, their resourcefulness. I wish I could do more as a mentor from afar. I, share my wisdom for whatever it's worth. I listen to their, challenges and try and give advice. Unfortunately, the founder's journey is sometimes a lonely and difficult one. Everyone has to sort of muddle through it themselves.
I think that makes for the perfect conclusion, also a hint towards Demo Day approaching. I think in December, it was moved from November to December. I'm not quite sure because I'm a part-time one-man band when I'm going to publish that episode myself, but it should be before Demo Day. So if it's before Demo Day, you have the link in the description to go have a look at what those aquapreneurs have built. In conclusion, if people want to follow up with you, where should I redirect them the best?
Either LinkedIn or we have an info email on our website. Read those with interest because sometimes we get very interesting communication from people that have exciting projects.
I would advise anyone anyways to go visit your website. As always, the link is in the description, so check it out. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that sometimes websites are a placeholder where you simply put the name of your brand and a bit of assets so that you establish yourself and then it's one and done. Instead of which your website goes into quite some depth into what you're doing, where you're doing it, how the projects are structured together. So really that was a cool resource for me. So I would advise people to have a look as well. Look, it was a pleasure. Thanks a lot. And I guess talk to you when the next step of Project Monarch yields its first ROI KPI numbers so that we can push the message even further that it's now or never.
Thank you. I appreciated the conversation.
Thanks for listening to Don't Waste Water. This podcast was brought to you by GF Piping Systems. Loved this episode? Head over to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. See you next time.